Okay, let's dive straight in. The Philadelphia experiment. I mean, just the name itself, it conjures up this wild image, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A huge warship, right?
Yeah.
Covered in this weird green fog.
And then it supposedly just vanishes. And you hear these really mind-bending stories about teleportation, jumping hundreds of miles, maybe even slipping through time.
Yeah, Philadelphia to Norfolk and back in minutes. That's the classic tale.
Now, if you're listening and thinking, hang on, that sounds pretty far-fetched, well, you're definitely not alone. It's one of those stories that, makes you instantly skeptical.
hmm But it's funny how it just sticks around, this legend. It has incredible staying power.
It really does. It taps into something, maybe our fascination with, like pushing science to the limit, or maybe just the fear of the unknown.
Could be both. So in this deep dive, we're not just aiming to say myth busted and move on.
No, exactly. We want to put on our scientific thinking caps, so to speak, and really look at the Philadelphia experiment through a more technical lens.
And we've got this really interesting document to work from, right? It actually tries to unpack the science and the history behind it all.
Yeah, it digs into things like Nikola Tesla's work, which is fascinating in itself, and what was going on with radar stealth tech during World War II.
And it even gets into some pretty heavy theoretical stuff like unified field theories. It's quite a mix.
It really is. And the crucial thing is the document doesn't just speculate wildly. It apparently includes some actual theoretical calculations, and they even mention doing some small-scale lab tests.
Right, trying to see if some of the basic principles hold up.
So our mission, if you will, is to try and, cut through that legendary fog. We want to separate what might have some potential scientific basis from the more out there claims.
Offering you, the listener, a clearer picture of what might have been actually attempted or maybe just theorized about back in 1943.
Okay, so starting point, Tesla. How big of an influence was Nikola Tesla on all this, according to the document?
Well, the document basically argues that Tesla's work is the foundational seed for the whole Philadelphia experiment idea.
A seed. Okay. How so?
They trace it back to, like, his really early stuff, his 1883 patent on rotating magnetic fields, patent number 381,968, apparently.
1883. Wow, that's early.
Yeah. And the point is, even back then, Tesla was exploring how magnetic fields could, interact with things dynamically. The document suggests this early work might connect to Einstein's later unified field theory ideas and also stuff Gabriel Tron was doing at GE in the 30s.
So the basic concept of using strong fields to manipulate stuff wasn't totally out of left field decades later.
Not entirely, no. It suggests a kind of lineage of ideas.
And it gets more specific, doesn't it? Didn't Tesla propose something directly involving a ship?
He did. This is pretty wild. In 1917, so during World War I, he apparently proposed building this massive rectangular coil, like a giant inductor right around a ship.
Around the whole ship?
Yeah, the dimensions they mention are like 400 feet long by 70 feet wide, basically the size of the ship.
Okay, that's huge. What was the point?
His idea then was about detecting enemy U-boats. He envisioned hooking this giant coil up to a really powerful, high-frequency oscillating current.
So detecting submarines, not making the ship invisible.
Right. But the key takeaway the document stresses is the concept. Wrapping a ship in a massive coil carrying a powerful current. Tesla was thinking about that decades before 1943 for military reasons.
That's a really important piece of context. So the idea wasn't just pulled out of thin air later.
Exactly. And the document notes that Tesla understood using pulsed currents in coils like this. And interestingly, they mention that ships wrapped in coils were actually seen during World War II.
Really? For what?
Well, likely for more mundane things like mine sweeping or degaussing, protecting against magnetic mines. But it shows the basic tech was being used.
Okay, so wrapping ships in wires wasn't science fiction.
No. And they also bring up Tesla's famous Egg of Columbus demonstration. Remember that?
Vaguely. He made a metal egg spin or stand-up.
Yeah, a copper egg stand on its end using a rotating magnetic field. It demonstrated gyromagnetic resonance, how magnetic fields can push things around, basically.
Oh, all right.
And the authors of the document apparently did their own small lab tests using a similar setup, trying to understand those basic interactions. So Tesla was definitely exploring how magnetism and materials interact.
Okay, so Tesla provides this really strong foundation, this conceptual basis. But what about the invisibility part, the core of the legend? How does the document tackle that?
Right. That takes us towards radar stealth and this thing called degaussing. The document looks at using special magnetic materials, magnetically biased ferrites, they call them, to try and make submarines less visible to radar doing WWI. They even mention the physicist Arnold Sommerfeld's work, related to this.
So hiding from radar, not necessarily the human eye.
Exactly. And they get into calculations trying to figure out how strong a magnetic field you'd actually need to, like, significantly cut down a ship's radar reflection. They mentioned aiming for less than 1% reflection at L-band radar frequencies around 1.5 gigahertz.
And could they achieve that kind of field strength?
Well, the document says the required field is in excess of some value, which they presumably detail later. But the focus shifts, you see. It's about managing the ship's electromagnetic signature, making it harder for radar to pick up.
That makes a lot more sense from a military perspective.
Totally. And they explain the physics a bit, using materials with what's called complex dielectric constant and permeability. Basically, materials that are good at absorbing microwave energy, like radar waves.
Kind of like stealth paint on modern aircraft, but an earlier concept.
Sort of, yeah. Using the properties of the material itself to soak up the radar energy. They even give the equations for permittivity, epsilon, and permeability, mu, mu, and how much power gets dissipated, p.
And this wasn't just a U.S. thing.
No, the document points out the Germans were working hard on this too, developing radar-absorbent materials for their U-boats, using stuff like carbonyl iron and layered conductive sheets.
So radar stealth was a genuine wartime race.
Absolutely. And then there's degaussing, which was very real and very common.
Right, you mentioned that protecting ships from magnetic mines.
Exactly. They literally wrapped ships in tons of heavy copper wire, heavily insulated. These coils, the document says, could be massive bundles as thick as your wrist. It took a huge amount of copper.
Wow. And those wires would carry a lot of electricity, presumably?
Oh, yeah. They estimate, based on like the fusing current of the copper wire, that these degaussing systems could potentially handle tens of thousands of amps if you really pushed them.
Tens of thousands. That's a massive amount of current.
It really is. So you've got this picture of ships already equipped with extensive, heavy-duty electrical coil systems.
Which brings up the obvious question. How do you power something like that, especially if you need currents that high? What about the ship allegedly involved, the USS Eldridge? What kind of power did it have?
Good question. The document gives the specs the Eldridge was a destroyer escort, the E-173. It had generators rated at 4,600 kVA each, giving about 6,000 horsepower total. So with both running, maybe around 9 megawatts of power.
Which sounds like a lot, but is it enough for those tens of thousands of amps?
Well, according to the document, probably not directly. Just using the ship's generators straight up to get those really high currents for strong magnetic effects would have been, let's say, challenging.
Okay, so was there a trick? How could they boost the current?
This is where Tesla's 1917 idea potentially comes back into play. The document suggests using something called a parallel resonant tank circuit.
A tank circuit? What's that?
Basically, you add capacitors in parallel with the big coils wrapped around the ship. If you tune it just right, get the capacitance and inductance to resonate at the generator's frequency, the current circulating within that coil capacitor loop can get much, much bigger than the current the generator is actually supplying.
Ah, like pushing a swing at the right time makes it go higher.
Exactly. It's resonant amplification. The current in the coil gets multiplied by a factor called the Q factor of the circuit. They give the equation. I coil is roughly Q times I terminal.
So you could get a much bigger magnetic effect with the same generator power.
Potentially, yes. And they also suggest that pulsing this circuit, maybe like a Class C oscillator works, could create the sharp rise in current needed for some of the alleged effects.
Okay, this is getting technical but interesting. Did they model this?
Apparently, yes. Appendix 2 of the document supposedly details an electrical model for a ship like the Eldridge. With this resonant circuit idea, they calculate things like the coil inductance, the Q factor, the impedance, how much capacitance you'd need.
And what current did they calculate they could get?
Their calculations suggested that a modest 4,500 kVA transformer, maybe drawing power from the ship's generators, could theoretically drive a circulating current in the main coils of around 15,000 amps.
15,000 amps. Okay, that's getting back up towards those huge numbers needed for strong fields.
Right. So the core idea here is that clever electrical engineering, based on principles Tesla was familiar with, could potentially generate much stronger magnetic fields than you might initially think, using the ship's available power. And that could lead to unexpected side effects.
Side effects. Okay, let's talk about those. If you did manage to create these incredibly strong, possibly pulsating magnetic fields around a ship, what might people actually see or experience? The phenomenological effects, as the document calls them.
Well, first they tackle that famous green fog or mist.
Yeah, that's always mentioned. What's the potential explanation?
They suggest low-frequency magnetohydrodynamics, MHD, in the saltwater.
Magnetohydrodynamics. Okay, break that down.
Strong magnetic fields interacting with a conducting fluid, which seawater definitely is. This could induce electrical currents, eddy currents in the water around the hull.
And what would those currents do?
Potentially, quite a bit. Agitate the water, maybe even pump it around. Cause localized heating, which could create steam or mist. They even speculate it could form a kind of cavity or hollow in the water right next to the ship.
A cavity in the water. Wow.
Yeah, and they point out that this description mist, maybe steam, a strange appearance in the water near the hull, actually matches some of the descriptions given in Moore Berlitz's book, which is a key source for the legend.
So, a possible physical explanation for the weird fog that aligns with some accounts. What else?
Ionization of the air. If you have rapidly changing, really strong magnetic fields, they can induce electric fields. They mentioned Joseph Sleeping's work and the Bidatron accelerator as examples.
Ionized air. Like a glow.
Possibly, especially if the power wasn't a smooth sine wave. If they were using pulsed DC or sudden capacitor discharges, you could get sharp voltage spikes off pointy objects on the ship. That might cause things like corona discharge, faint glows, sparks, or something called tritial pulses.
So, strange visual effects beyond just fog. What about sounds? People reported weird noises, right?
The document suggests the strong, low-frequency magnetic fields could literally make the ship's hull, and maybe even the nearby water vibrate, like the hum you hear from a big transformer, but maybe much more intense.
A loud hum, okay.
And they speculate that harmonics, higher frequency vibrations generated by the main low frequency, could even reach into the ultrasonic range. You wouldn't hear ultrasound directly, but maybe it could be perceived as that unbearable whine some accounts mention.
Okay, so we've got plausible sounding physical mechanisms for fog, glows, and weird noises, all linked to intense electromagnetic fields. Now, what about the people, the crew, the biological effects?
Yeah, this is where it gets pretty disturbing to think about. Imagine being right in the middle of those intense, pulsing magnetic fields, and maybe those weird sound vibrations too.
It would be completely unlike anything anyone had experienced before.
Totally. The document talks about things like magnetophosphines.
Magneto what now?
Phosphines. Those little flashes or spots of light you can sometimes see when you rub your eyes. Apparently, strong magnetic fields can also trigger similar sensations directly in your visual system. And also Purkinje figures, which are patterns you might see in your own eyes, blood vessels, under certain conditions.
So the fields could make people literally see things that weren't there.
Possibly. Or misinterpret things they did see. The document even speculates this could be a factor in the really bizarre claims about seeing alien humanoids, maybe extreme visual distortions caused by the fields. They reference research by Knoll and Kugler on inducing subjective light patterns with electrical pulses.
Wow. Okay. That's unsettling.
And there's more. They mention the possibility of beats. If there were slightly different frequencies interacting, it might create undulating or moving phosphines, based on work by someone named Oster.
So not just static lights, but moving patterns.
Potentially. And then there's direct brain stimulation. The changing magnetic fields create tiny electrical voltages inside the brain itself.
That sounds bad.
Well, they suggest it could potentially cause the blanking out episodes or the feeling of being frozen that some crew members supposedly reported, like the field was interfering directly with neural function.
That is deeply disturbing. Were there potential long-term effects mentioned?
Yes. They bring up the possibility of AC dielectric heating. Because brain tissue has certain electrical properties, complex permittivity, the strong alternating fields could have actually heated the tissue internally, similar to how a diathermy machine works in physical therapy, but uncontrolled.
Heating the brain tissue.
Yeah. And that kind of internal heating could plausibly lead to all sorts of neurological or psychological problems down the line.
Okay, so putting this together, a lot of the really weird, scary, and disorienting parts of the story, the fog, the sounds, the visual stuff, the crew being incapacitated or acting strangely, might actually have explanations rooted in the physics of extreme electromagnetic fields and their effect on the human body.
That's certainly the picture the document seems to paint.
Uh-huh.
It provides a framework for understanding some of the phenomena without resorting to, outright magic.
But that leads to the big question, doesn't it? If a lot of this could be explained by known physics, even if extreme, and by physiological effects, why the secrecy? Why would the Navy deny it so vehemently for decades?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the document acknowledges the really wild claims, the teleportation from Philly to Norfolk and back in minutes. They quote some of those accounts.
The parts that seem impossible.
Right. And the document is pretty blunt here. It says macroscopic teleportation, moving a whole ship like that, or time travel.
Mm,
It's just not plausible with the kind of energy involved. We're talking maybe 9 megawatts from the generators.
yeah.
That's nowhere near enough to significantly warp space-time in the way theories like general relativity would require.
So ship teleporting? Probably not.
Very unlikely based on this analysis. They suggest more mundane explanations for those specific claims.
Yeah.
Confusion, maybe people were disoriented by the fields, perhaps even intoxication, playing a role in how stories got told and retold. A much more grounded perspective.
But the document does then dip into some really theoretical physics, right? You mentioned unified field theories earlier.
It does, yeah. It takes a bit of a speculative detour. It talks about concepts like spin and torsion and this idea of a crinkled space-time. These ideas come from Einstein's later attempts, which weren't successful, we should add, to unify gravity and electromagnetism, and also from Gabriel Cron's work again.
Torsion. Like
Yeah.
twisting space-time.
Sort of. It's a highly mathematical concept.
Hmm.
The document mentions the theoretical idea that maybe localized torsion could allow for temporal displacements jumps in time, based on some complex equations they apparently provide.
So time travel related to spin and twisting space.
It's presented as this sort of enchanting idea, as they put it, leaping along your world line because of spin. But it's crucial to stress, this is highly theoretical and speculative, even within the document.
Okay, definitely fringe science territory.
Very much so. They try to explain the math concepts briefly
Yeah.
in holonomy and torsion. And holonomy is basically about how paths don't always reconnect smoothly in curved or rotating systems. It's relevant for things like GPS, actually.
Yeah.
But you can often get rid of it by changing your coordinates.
But torsion is different.
Torsion, in this theoretical context, would be a more fundamental property of space-time itself, a kind of intrinsic twist that you can't just transform away. They even link it mathematically to quantum mechanical spin using something called a contortion tensor.
This is getting deep. Do they connect it to anything real?
Well, they mention the Sagnac effect, which is real and related to rotation and holonomy used in fiber optic gyros, and they propose some thought experiments like putting photon gyros on a spinning platform to see if you could detect or cancel rotational effects with these hypothetical torsion fields.
And they bring up the Aharonov-Bohm effect, too.
Yeah, another weird quantum thing where magnetic potentials can affect electrons even where the magnetic field is zero. The document speculates, and again, this is pure speculation, that maybe atomic spins create a torsion field linked to this potential, and maybe you could use Aharonov-Bohm experiments as torsion field strength meters.
Okay, my head is starting to spin a little.
Uh-huh. Yeah, it's pretty out there. But the key point is, the document itself concludes this section by saying that while teleportation and time jumps can be mathematically played with in these torsion theories, they remain unanswered questions, highly speculative ideas. There's no claim that this is what happened.
Got it. So, theoretical musings, but not an explanation for the Philadelphia experiment legend itself. Let's pull back to the history then. The story often drops some big names, Einstein, von Neumann.
Right. The document notes the alleged involvement of Einstein, Tesla, John von Neumann, Vannevar Bush. It does confirm Einstein was a consultant for the Navy during the war.
And wasn't there something about him being in Philadelphia?
Yeah, apparently an FBI file indicates Einstein was in Philly around the time the experiment supposedly happened. But again, being there doesn't mean he was involved in this.
Correlation, not causation. And the official Navy line remains.
Total myth. They trace the story's popular origin to a 1955 book about UFOs.
But the document does try to ground things with facts about the ship and the time period.
Yes, it mentions the specific ship, USS Eldridge, DE-173, gives its specs from Jane's fighting ships. Yeah. And it highlights that destroyer escorts, like the Eldridge, were documented as being used to provide shore power, sometimes running cables to land.
Ah, so maybe someone saw the Eldridge hooked up with heavy cables, generating lots of power, and misinterpreted it.
That's a plausible alternative explanation for some accounts, yeah. They even cite a 1948 paper with photos of this kind of setup.
And the name Philadelphia experiment itself might have caused confusion.
Possibly. The document points out that Benjamin Franklin's famous electricity experiments back in the 18th century were also known as Philadelphia experiments, so the name itself might have muddy history.
Interesting. What about the witnesses cited in the books?
The document takes a critical look. It suggests some witnesses lacked technical understanding, and some of the ways the stories came out were, let's say, unorthodox. It also discusses T. Townsend Brown, who did work for the Navy on radar invisibility. So maybe invisibility research was happening, but it was about radar, not visual cloaking.
Right, the more plausible explanation, and the idea that the whole thing was just a hoax.
The document addresses that, specifically looking at Jacques Vallée's arguments. It actually criticizes Vallée's paper, suggesting logical flaws and maybe not enough homework done, particularly about a Dr. Paul Beifeld.
Who was he?
Apparently a former classmate of Einstein's, which Vallée seemed to dismiss or overlook. The document implies this connection might be more significant. So it argues against dismissing it purely as a hoax, suggesting maybe real experiments got twisted into the legend.
And it circles back to Einstein's theories at the end.
Just briefly, mentioning his lifelong quest for a unified field theory, trying to link electromagnetism and gravity. Those later theories did involve concepts like asymmetric metrics and torsion, hinting that manipulating spacetime via electromagnetism was something even he was theoretically exploring, even if those specific theories didn't pan out.
Okay, so let's try and summarize this deep dive. What are the main takeaways from exploring this document?
Well, I think the big one is that there seems to be potential scientific plausibility for some parts of the story. The green fog, weird sounds, the strange effects on the crew. The document suggests these could plausibly be explained by known physics, specifically the effects of really intense, possibly pulsed electromagnetic fields, drawing on Tesla's ideas in wartime research into things like radar stealth and degaussing.
But not the teleportation or time travel.
Right, those really fantastical claims. The document paints them as highly speculative at best, lacking a solid basis in the science discussed, and much more likely stemming from misinterpretation, maybe the sheer confusion and stress of wartime, or even the physiological effects of the fields themselves altering perception.
So a kernel of possible truth related to electromagnetic experiments wrapped in layers of legend and misunderstanding.
That seems to be the thrust of the analysis, yeah.
Which brings us back to that secrecy question. If it wasn't teleportation, why the big denial from the Navy?
The document offers a thought there. Even if they weren't teleporting ships, experimenting with extremely high-power electromagnetic fields that could have serious, unpredictable, and potentially harmful effects on personnel. Well, that's something any military might be very hesitant to admit to, right?
Especially during a major war.
Exactly. The inherent dangers, the potential for physiological harm, the risk of alarming rumors spreading, even if the goal was just radar stealth. All that could easily lead to a decision to just deny everything and classify whatever was done. Plausible deniability.
Okay, so maybe the secrecy wasn't about hiding teleportation tech, but about hiding potentially dangerous experiments on personnel, even if unintentional.
That's a plausible interpretation based on the document's perspective. A mix of genuine experimental work, misinterpreted side effects, wartime pressures, and then an understandable, if frustrating, layer of official secrecy.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? This whole enduring legend. Maybe its persistence, even without solid proof for the wildest parts, tells us something about ourselves. Like, this deep human fascination with the idea of controlling fundamental forces, manipulating reality, maybe even bending space and time. It's a fascination that clearly wasn't just limited to pulp magazines. Scientists like Tesla and Einstein were grappling with these profound questions in their own ways.
Yeah, pushing the boundaries of what's possible or even conceivable.
Exactly. So maybe the Philadelphia experiment story, regardless of the factual details, keeps resonating because it touches on that boundary, the line between scientific ambition, technological striving, and how powerful myths are born.
A sort of cautionary tale and an inspirational one, all mixed together.
Maybe. It certainly encourages you, the listener, to maybe dig a bit deeper into some of these concepts: electromagnetism, unified field theories, the actual history of radar and naval technology. There's a lot of fascinating real science tangled up in this enduring enigma.
Definitely food for thought.